If you've listened to Brülosophy at all, you know how much we love Imperial yeast. The company was founded on the ideal that if you're going to do something, do it right. From their Imperial pitch-right pouches, packing a whopping 200 billion cells of healthy and viable yeast in each pouch, to their commitment to commercial customers, guaranteeing 10 of their most popular strains are in stock for orders up to 20 liters, or the shipping is free, Imperial yeast does it right. No more worrying about whether you need to make a starter or propagate your yeast prior to pitching. Imperial yeast makes it easy for the home brewer and commercial brewer to obtain direct pitches at proper rates when you need it. To place a commercial order or to get more information about everything that Imperial yeast has to offer, head on over to imperialyeast.com. Welcome to the Brew Lab. American brewers often romanticize about international beer styles that we have trouble sourcing here in the United States. Getting a Czech Pilsner Urquell or a true Munich Helles or a Westvleteren 12 isn't as easy as, say, getting a hazy IPA. And for many brewers, it's why they got into craft brewing in the first place. They tried an amazing beer on some international trip in a hidden bar, and they want to recreate it at home. I'm your host, Cade Jobin. Today I'm back in the lab with my co-host, Jordan Folks, as we talk about last week's episode, Hidden Beers of Belgium, with Brendan Kearney. And we're going to discuss a little bit about how to make Belgian-style beers at home.
For homebrewers of our generation, it seems that Belgian beers is a really common hook. For me, for sure, on my craft beer journey when I was turning 21, at the time, growing up where I lived, craft beer hadn't really taken off yet, and it was these European imports. That was the exciting beer relative to like Bud Miller Coors. And Hoegaarden really was what set me on my craft beer journey. Was that beer just really blew me away and was totally unlike any of these macros I had tried stateside. I'm curious, did you have a similar experience with Belgian beers really being an early hook for you?
Yeah, totally. I mean, Belgian beers were like, they were this unique fancy thing, right? Like those were like the you know, like we talk about like fancy, expensive wines. And to me, that was always what Belgian beers were, you know, and the only examples that I had were like the Chimay and stuff that made it over, you know, and they were often oxidized unless they were, you know, bottle reconditioned. And you know, that was tough. And yeah, I definitely first brewing experiments were doubles, and then I switched into wit beers and started brewing a whole bunch of different Belgian styles. And I really just liked the impact yeast had too, which we'll talk more about that. I don't want to get too far into that right now. But one of the reasons why I think people have this fanaticism about Belgian beers is because their pub culture is protected by UNESCO. It's incredible. And it's kind of a statement about the impact of that pub culture and brewing tradition on the country and on the world. And as Brendan mentioned on last week's show, walking into a Belgian pub really is a historical and memorable experience. And now I got to visit Belgium for the first time earlier this year, and it was definitely memorable. We got to try like Westvleteren and Duvel and Cantillon and Bonn and Rodenbach and a host of other breweries, but we also got to try some of those hidden places that Brendan talked about, like Dock Brewing, or one that I talked about, Lambic Fabrique and Kazematten, which weren't featured in his book, but were places that were on the short list. And one of the key things was trying to classify Belgian beers. There's so many styles, so many ways to brew Belgian beer, and so, hey, I mean, this is a perfect applying the science, right? Jordan, you have some hardware associated with some of the Belgian beers that you've brewed. And I certainly love brewing Belgian styles too. So we'll kind of take a 30,000-foot view here. We're not going to dive into any one style in particular. We're going to cover a lot of ground on this episode, so buckle up. But first, if you're not already a patron of Brülosophy, it would be really cool if you take a minute to support us. Just go to patreon.com/Brülosophy and you can look at all of the different rewards that are available to you depending on your monthly contribution level. Rewards like unpublished contributor recipes, discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invite to a monthly live Q&A session. It's only a few bucks a month, and it does help us continue do what we're doing here at Brülosophy. And if you sign up quickly, this weekend's guest is my friend and colleague, Dr. Scott LaFontaine. You should recognize him, of course, from his initial research on dry hop saturation points, but also from his more recent research on rice malt. And Scott is one of the brightest and most brilliant upcoming brewing scholars in the United States. And so this is your opportunity to pick his brain. And so you can do that. Don't miss out. You have to go to patreon.com/Brülosophy to sign up. We've got such an active group of Brülosophy followers, from our patrons to our website and YouTube channel followers to people who email in feedback or folks who share and discuss our results at homebrew club meetings. It's super humbling and rewarding to hear all of the engagement that you have with Brülosophy. And so, of course, I just want to say thank you for that. And, of course, if you haven't yet left a comment or review or sent in an email, I'd love to hear from you. My email is cade@brülosophy.com, or you can leave a comment or review of the show wherever it is that you listen to podcasts. All right, for feedback this week, listener John wrote in. He said, "Hey guys, love the show. I have a question about diacetyl reducing enzymes. Recently, I've started using ALDC every time I make an IPA, and though I'm not sure I ever really had a problem with diacetyl, I use it more like insurance because I only get to brew on the weekends and it's too much time lost and effort to dump a batch. Anyway, I've been getting a strong candy-like fruity sweet character since I started using ALDC. Have you noticed any flavor changes from using ALDC apart from diacetyl? Keep up the good work, John."
So, John, I have not had that experience personally, and I'm using it in both traditional lagers as well as IPAs. We actually did an experiment on the lager side. I brewed, I think it was a fest beer, and used ALDC in one half, and then did not use ALDC in the other. And tasters could not reliably taste the difference. Neither could I in my blind triangles. I will say that luckily, the fermentation that I did in the control batch didn't generate excessive diacetyl. So I think that it really demonstrates that it's just a really good piece of insurance. But on the hoppy side, maybe this candy-like character could possibly come from oxidation, and it's just an unfortunate coincidence here. Maybe older hops, maybe use of like crystal malts, but given how much experience I have using ALDC in hoppy beers, I'm skeptical to think that the candy-like character is coming from ALDC specifically, but we have not done a test comparing ALDC in a hoppy beer versus one without, so we don't really have any evidence either way.
Yeah, it's interesting because like I could go down some rabbit trails here, right? And I can certainly see how like you start using the ALDC and then you perceive a difference in the beer. It's not been my experience when using ALDC that I taste like fruity characteristics or something like that. But it is sort of like yeast related, right? And I wonder like when somebody says candy like fruity, I always think of esters, and then esters are produced by yeast, and yeah, we're using ALDC, and so maybe there's something here that feels more like a rabbit trail to me. It feels more like maybe like Jordan suggested, maybe some oxygen that is getting in. I don't know when you're adding the ALDC, John, but if you're adding it during fermentation or at the time that you're dry hopping, maybe something's changed with your dry hopping practices, or the fermenter is open a little bit longer because you're adding the ALDC. I'm not sure. Maybe that's related to it. But I think I would check those places first. And if you've checked those places, like you've checked oxygen and you haven't changed your yeast, or you're not dealing with your yeast differently, that would be a big one. If you've changed your yeast, or if you're looking at a different, strain or repitching or something like that, and you're starting to get if you've harvested and are repitching and you're starting to get that strong candy-like flavor, I would say that might be generational change in your yeast. So that might be a place to look. But it's interesting. I mean, yeah, given the results of Jordan's experiment and my own personal experience using ALDC, I'm not sure that the ALDC has anything to do with the strong candy-like fruity flavor. But again, I could go down some rabbit trails with you. So maybe not the most satisfying of answers, but keep brewing and let us know. Maybe try a side-by-side batch, right? Split it into two fermenters, pitch ALDC into one and not in the other, and see if you're still getting that candy-like fruity aroma. And maybe that'll help you track it down. Anyway, thanks, John, for the feedback, and thanks for listening. All right, after this short break, we'll be back talking about how to make Belgian beers at home. The dry yeast revolution is here, and Cellar Science is leading the charge. Cellar Science has expanded the world of dry yeast far beyond the drab landscape of yesteryear. With over 20 strains of beer and wine yeast now available, you can brew any style. Not to mention that their unique growth and harvesting process greatly increases lipid levels in yeast cell walls, removing the need to aerate your wort on the first pitch and allowing you to directly pitch without rehydration. Couple that with the other advantages of dry yeast, such as higher cell count and viability, and you can clearly see why commercial breweries across the U.S. are using dry yeast and choosing Cellar Science.
Black Friday week starts November 21st, and so are amazing deals at Amazon. You'll save so much on early holiday fashion gifts, like cozy fits and stylish shirts. You'll have money left over for the matching sweaters everyone definitely wants to wear for the holiday card.
Cheese.
Or that ugly holiday sweater that's like really ugly.
OMG, that's like really ugly.
Oh, what fun it is to save. Black Friday week starts on November 21st with new deals added every day.
Got great ideas, but no idea how to build a website? Get Bluehost. Their AI design tool creates high-quality WordPress sites super fast. Whether you're a blogger, influencer, or launching a side hustle, Bluehost helps boost your growth with built-in marketing and e-commerce tools. Upgrade to cloud and get 100% uptime and 24/7 security to stay online all the time. Why wait? You've got the vision. Make it real. Visit Bluehost.com to get started.
Did you know a 2018 study showed half of prenatal vitamins tested had unacceptable levels of heavy metals? I'm Kat, mother of 3 and founder of Ritual. When I was 4 months pregnant, I couldn't find a prenatal I could trust, so I created my own. Ours is made traceable, third-party tested for heavy metals, and recently earned the Purity Award from the Clean Label Project. But don't just take my word for it. Get 25% off at ritual.com/prenatal.
I used to think that American brewers had a romantic fascination with beers brewed internationally, like German Pils, British cask ales, Belgian Trappist ales, but once I started brewing for myself at home, I realized it's much less about romanticism and much more about availability. Imported beers spend months on unrefrigerated boats, and quality ultimately suffers. If you want a good example, like that example you had in a hidden bar or a hidden beer of that hidden beer in Belgium, your best bet as an American is to kind of make it for yourself. Don't you think, Jordan?
I really totally agree. We are able to make beers that really rival these European examples at home, given the access to quality ingredients that we have today. And so, like we'll talk about in this episode, these are definitely beers that you can brew at home. In fact, I think Belgian beer is a really good starter beer for newer home brewers because the yeast fermentation is so much more forgiving than a cleaner American or German style. So, why don't we dive into it? What beer style do you want to talk about first?
Well, before we dive into the styles, I think that's a fantastic point, and I think that's kind of the ethos you'll see in my comments as we talk about brewing Belgian beers today, is that Belgian beer styles are really hard to define. There's a lot of flexibility. It is a great starter beer style. So if you've got a friend that's looking to get into brewing or doesn't really know much about beer, but they want to brew something fun and exciting, man, Belgian styles are the way to go. You can do so much. You can brew, light, clean, refreshing, crisp ales. You can brew crazy Brett fermented goo, sour fruited beers. There's just the whole gamut, and everything is really forgiving. So I think that's a fantastic point, and I did want to emphasize that, Jordan. And of course, we talked a lot about the diversity last week with Brendan. How there's really just so many things. When you walk into a Belgian beer pub, it's not like IPA, lager, right? It's a host of different types of beers: dark, light, fruited, not fruited, sour, Brett, all kinds of barrel, everything. And that's one of the things I love about Belgian beers. But like Jordan was saying, it adds a lot of flexibility. And so you'll hear me say throughout the episode today, Jordan, I'm sure I'll hear you say it too. Yeah, you can probably do that, right? Like, and you can still make a good example of that Belgian style. But I think, Jordan, it makes sense. Let's start off sort of light and then go dark. And then maybe we'll get into that farmhouse and sour stuff after the break. So why don't we start with that tricky, pesky style that you probably won't find here in the United States unless you're doing something like a Anheuser-Busch Leffe, but that Belgian blonde.
Right. And so this is a style that I haven't brewed in a while. It's been maybe 10 years or so since I last brewed one. But my buddy brewed one recently, and wow, they are so good. Yeah. And I think that really what defines pretty much all of these sub-styles is yeast. And There's probably some flexibility, but I think generally speaking, we can say this at the front end, that these are tend to be diastaticus, so highly attenuative yeast, as well as POF positive or phenolic forward yeast strains, right? And so you're getting a really interesting character in the beer from that yeast. And I think that that's something that you really need to be thinking about when designing any of these beers. That's really the first thing I start to think about when making a Belgian beer is what is my yeast source. So for Belgian Blonde, I really like the Le Chouffe strain. It has this really nice, like peppery kind of like spicy thing. It's just really a fantastic yeast. And I mean, other than that, you're looking at Pilsner malt and noble type hops. So I think that there's probably a lot of, leeway in which a given direction, how much you use of that or when you add your hops here and there. But I think that it's a fairly simple style and a really good one to for a new homebrewer to give it a try, or an advanced homebrewer to really refine and try to knock it out of the park.
Yeah, and not to beat a dead horse, but I think this is one of those styles you can be really creative with as well too. Like you mentioned that yeast is super important here, and yeah, I was actually joking with Cecile, my Belgian colleague, Cecile Chenot, and I was saying, what defines a Belgian beer? How do you even say what a Belgian beer is? And my first reaction was, oh, POF, it's phenolic off flavor positive. And she goes, no, these beers aren't phenolic. And I start naming them off like Leffe, Le Chouffe, any Belgian Abbey style. And she's like, okay, yeah, those are all phenolic. And so that's kind of a piece of it, right? Is yeast here. But the cool thing about Belgian brewing is that a lot of it, like I talked about with Brendon, it's based on local ingredients. So yeah, that Pilsner malt is going to be the backbone of a Belgian blonde. I mean, a blonde is blonde, right? That's the key thing. You don't really want to use dark malts. I'd shy away from those. But anything, you could use two-row, you could use American two-row, you could use Pilsner malt, you can use Belgian Pilsner malt, right? You can use probably Maris Otter. Floor malted UK
I wouldn't
malt.
use that.
Yeah, you wouldn't? You think that's too much? Yeah, that is true, because for this one, you're not really looking for anything to shine other than the yeast, and that is a key point, right? One thing that you could do is use like wheat malt or oats for a little bit for like foam. That's a key thing that we'll see in Belgian beers is that thick head of foam and carbonation. So yeah, that yeast character is really important. I like what Jordan was talking about with those peppery phenolic characteristics, but I think you can also make them lightly phenolic. They don't really have to be super phenolic or super estery in a Belgian blonde style. They can just really be nice and crushable. And so there is a lot of flexibility here. I mean, again, don't go too crazy. This is a blonde. It's meant to be in that like 5 to 6% range. It's not meant to be super alcoholic. It's not meant to it's meant to be just kind of nice and crushable. And I think that's the key thing for this. Explore that yeast character. Use some of those lightly colored malt, noble hops. I wouldn't use, Mosaic or Citra in a Belgian blonde. But hey, who knows? I mean, in small amounts or as bittering additions, maybe you'd get some interesting characteristics from those. But yeah, definitely more of those traditional European continental style noble hops. I don't know. Anything else for a Belgian blonde, Jordan, that you would add there?
Well, I was going to say in our notes here, the next thing we were going to talk about is strong blonde. So I think this is a transition question is what's the difference? Because pulling up the BJCP guidelines, the Belgian blonde ale category 25A is OG 1062 to 1075 with an ABV of 6 to 7.5. So, granted, our American attempt to categorize Belgian beers is inherently flawed. So, I think take everything that we say today with a grain of salt because they don't think about these things as strictly as we do. But in your mind, what's the difference between a quote Belgian blonde and a strong blonde?
Yeah, a strong blonde. The main difference to me is going to be alcohol a character. So a strong blonde is going to be above 7, I would say above 7.5, and it's going to get that alcohol character without adding a whole lot of body. right? It's going to be crisp and clean and really refreshing and effervescent. And the way that they're going to do that, and this is kind of a key ingredient difference, is by using like a Belgian candy sugar, like a clear candy sugar, or straight up dextrose. Which might be another, or table sugar for that matter. But the whole point is really drive up that starting gravity, really drive down that attenuation, use a highly attenuative yeast, but still keep that like light blonde characteristic. And to me, it's just higher alcohol. It's kind of like, okay, here's a Belgian blonde, and then here's a higher alcohol. You might also have heard this referred to as Belgian Golden Strong, but the beer that I think defines this style is one of those beers that is not a hidden beer of Belgium. It's one that's wildly popular, and it's Duvel. And the reason for the name Duvel is allegedly because, whenever one of the Mortgott family members was brewing this beer, he was showing it off, and he showed it to his brewer friend, and his brewer friend said, "Wow, that beer's a real devil." And because it's an 8.5% beer that doesn't taste like an 8.5% beer. I mean, it's nice. And especially if you got fresh examples there in Belgium, it's a really tasty beer. Now, it is bottle re-fermented, right? So it has a secondary fermentation in the bottle. And as I understand correctly, they let it sit for 6 weeks at a room temperature sort of conditioning, so that and that's after the re-fermentation of the bottle is complete. It's just sitting for 6 weeks at this sort of conditioning area, so that all of these sort of nice, wonderful aromas, esters and things can really come about and really play this like nice yeast forward, but still crisp and clean and really drinkable beer.
Right. And I think that that's another really important strategy for making the best Belgian beers you possibly can, is to bottle condition any of them. There isn't a single style that I would recommend kegging is the priority. And as soon as I say that out loud, I can think of a couple exceptions. Probably a wit beer might not be as important, nor a Belgian pale ale, which is not very phenolic at all. But I think that most of these yeast forward ones that you really want to bottle condition, something magic happens in there. And there's a couple things. One is the carbonation level that you can achieve. These are highly carbonated beers, like pretty much across the board, and you just can't have the same level of carbonation on draft. It's just not, really very feasible from a, mechanics perspective. Secondly, I swear there's some magic in bottle conditioning, right? That like this re-fermentation does something that makes these things just round out and really finish off in the best way possible. Arguably, there's probably better foam production there, just because you're able to pack so much more carbonation into the package that you can get this really pillowy foam that looks really beautiful in these traditional Belgian glassware. So I would totally agree with that. And then I just want to correct one thing that you said. You said that the big difference between a Belgian Golden Strong and a Belgian Blonde is the addition of sugar. Well, there are Belgian blondes, like single strength Belgian blondes that use sugar as well. And I think that is another actually really interesting thing about Belgian beer is a lot of these, especially on the Abbey kind of persuasion, will use these simple sugars as part of the grist. So to me, that's another really big differentiator in terms of the Belgian beer tradition.
Yeah, I totally agree with you there. The use of adjuncts is wildly appropriate in Belgian beers, right? And that's part of Okay, so sort of a funny story here. We had just landed in Brussels, and we went straight over to Ghent, and we were going to go visit the university in Ghent. There, one of our brewing colleagues across the ocean over there, and we were just we had done that, and we were kind of trying to stay awake amidst our hangover, and we went to this pub called the Waterhouse, and it's on the river right in downtown Ghent. And we open up the beer menu, and of course, there's like 150 beers on the menu, right? And by the way, each of those does have their own particular glassware, and so think about the logistics of that for a minute. But we start looking, and one of the first entries is Belgian table beer, 8.5%, and everyone's like, and we just kind of looked at each other and went, "What?" Like, okay, we're in a different place here. We're in a very, very different era. And so you're right? If we were talking about starting with a lighter style in German or the American persuasion, we would not be talking about a 6 or 7% beer, right? And so that's a very good point. I think the amount of candy sugar that's used, you don't have to use candy sugar or dextrose in a Belgian blonde, but in Duvel, to not make it cloyingly sweet and to not drive up your residual extract, or to not in a golden strong, I think you have to use something like a dextrose or candy sugar, because it really is going to drive up that attenuation and that alcohol level without adding all of that residual body and residual extract. I know that might just be a me thing though. What do you think, Jordan? Do you think you have to use dextrose to make a golden strong or something like it?
I think that you do want to use sugar, but I think that the jury is out as to whether the specific sugar source matters.
Yeah.
Maybe there'd be a difference between like maple syrup or, table sugar, or, something that's a little more dramatic like molasses versus candies, the lowest Lovabond candy syrup. But I think that if you want to go the extra mile and pay the extra $1, use the candy syrup or the rock candy sugar. That stuff is authentic and it works great. But honestly, priming sugar or table sugar will work just fine. And there's plenty of anecdotes of people doing brewery tours at Abbeys and just seeing giant sacks of table sugar sitting around.
Yeah, of course. And I would say there's several Brülosophy experiments out there too, where we've looked at different sugars, for priming sugars or sugar additions. And while some sugars may or may not add things like honey, might add a little bit of a flavor characteristic, maple syrup typically doesn't, right? It doesn't add a flavor characteristic. It might add a little bit of color. Depends on when and where you're adding it. If you're adding it at 20%, then yeah, you might get some maple flavor characteristic. But yeah, that's totally right. So I totally agree, Jordan. I think we both are on the same page here. Some sort of sugar source to drive that attenuation in alcohol. But the specific sugar source is kind of up to you in terms of what you want to use. Now, that does bring up another point too. We've mentioned several times diastatic yeasts and highly attenuative strains, but there's also the mashing technique that I think plays a role in Belgian beers, and that is two things that I think are really important. That protein rest, I think, is really important for Belgian beers to get that foam that you want, to make it really nice and thick and pillowy. I mean, if you look at a glass of Duvel, it's a chalice. It's a giant goblet. It's a goblet of beer. And you pour the beer directly into the bottom, and half of the glass is foam and half of the glass is beer. You'd never be able to generate that much foam with a macro lager, right? It'd just never be possible. It would all dissipate and it would all go away. But that's the thing about those Belgian beers, that foam is so important. But from a mashing perspective, from a process perspective, I think it's important to do a protein rest. Yes, you can still do a single infusion mash, but if you have the capability to do a protein rest, do that, because it's going to help you with your foam retention. The other thing is fermentability, and to have a highly attenuative, highly fermentable mash that's not cloyingly sweet, you want a low mash temperature. So I'm talking in that 55 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit or Celsius, and the 145 to 150 degrees Fahrenheit. So in that lower beta amylase appropriate rest. So I think with those things, that will really help you drive that strength of the blonde, of the golden strong or the strong blonde, depending on what you describe it. Now, but I think this is a good opportunity to transition over into the Abbey styles, because the first Abbey style sounds a lot like the two beers that we just brewed, right? Which is the Abbey, the single.
Right, and it's like some of these differentiations are so minor, and for those that want to maximize the number of points you're scoring in a homebrew competition, you wouldn't be the first to enter your beer in both Belgian single and Belgian blonde. And it takes a fairly advanced palate to detect the difference. And for me, I would say that really the biggest difference is the yeast strain. Now we're getting into these Abbey style yeast strains. So for example, my friend entered a single that he had made using the Lachauffre strain, and the comments on the score sheets were like, this isn't the right, yeast strain. This is not an Abbey or Trappist strain. So people that are really into these beers can tell the difference. And although I thought his single was so beautiful and amazing, if we want to be following BJCP guidelines for the purposes of competition, maybe you want to choose a Trappist strain. So from Imperial, they have triple double. On the website, you can find a recipe from me that uses Bootleg Biology's OB Belgian. So there are definitely a few Trappist strains out there that you can access. But again, we're looking very simple. Some 100% Pilsner malt with a little bit of sugar. You can use candy sugar. You can use just straight table sugar, and then some noble hops. Fun little transition comment here is I actually tested the bottling sugar type on a Belgian single. We compared a simple like homebrew priming sugar dextrose versus a liquid Belgian candy sugar, and tasters could not tell the difference. And I got to tell you, the foam production, the foam, creation, formation, and retention was insane on these beers, despite the sugar. But I will say, Cade, I didn't do a protein rest. So I think that if you want really big head, using a proper bottle and a proper carbonation priming rate is definitely one way in which you can get really intense foam formation and retention without the need for a protein rest.
Yeah, that's totally true. And again, like I said, you can use a infusion mash to make it. I think the protein rest is important because it's just going to add a little bit of nuance to the foam. The foam will be just fine if you've got an all malt beer and you're adding some of those sugars and stuff to it. Brewing as you normally would with a single infusion mash is going to create those matrices that you need for foam. And the single, I think. One of the things that makes it challenging too about like single versus blonde versus golden strong and kind of like where we are in these nuances, a single is an Abbey style beer, and one of the challenges is like one of the most well-known Abbeys is Westfaletteren, right? It's a St. Bernardus and Westfaletteren is the brand, and Westfaletterin's single is called Westfaletteren Blonde. And I had it sitting in the courtyard outside of Westfaletteren, which is that's a beer mecca experience, right? If you ever go on beer travel to Belgium, that's just something you have to do, right? If you go to Egypt, you have to visit the Great Pyramids. If you go to Rome, you have to visit the Colosseum or the Spanish Steps. It is what it is, right? If you go to Guinness or go to Dublin, you've got to visit Guinness and St. James Gate, right? It just is what it is. One of those things. And Westfaletteren Blonde is really nice whenever it's fresh, but it's that light color, right? So there's no dark malts again. We still haven't gotten into any styles that use dark colors or dark candy syrups or anything like that. We're still light. And interestingly, I find this a little surprising. The BJCP guidelines say for Belgian single that it's a 4.8 to 6% beer. But for Belgian Blonde, they say 6 to 7.5% ABV. So this one would seem like it would have a little bit lower alcohol content. And I think maybe that's true. But then on the style comparison, they say it's much more like a smaller, a more highly hopped Belgian triple than a Belgian blonde ale. And I'm like, man, how does that work? And I think you're right there, Jordan. I think for this, it's the yeast character. I think Abbey style yeasts have this very particular character. And so for Imperial, that's triple double. And I think you can use triple double on any of the Abbey style beers. Be careful though, because triple double, in my opinion, has a very strong black pepper phenol. And that can come through depending on your fermentation temperature and a whole bunch of different other characteristics. But that black pepper phenol can be a little bit overwhelming to me sometimes. I kind of prefer that clovey note, and even getting into those like blankety and barnyardy sort of characteristics. Not Brett. I'm not talking full Brett, but I'm talking more in that like spicy realm. Those sort of more stinky phenols than just the like pepper ones that we might see there. But yeah, that I think that's the key difference here between a blonde and a golden strong. The single is lower ABV, so again, still in that like 6% range. I think I would be comfortable saying, but with those Abbey style notes. Now, White Labs has Abbey Ale, Omega has Belgian Ale A, which I think the A means Abbey. I'm not really sure, but I think it does. But those styles of beer, or those styles of yeast. I'm sorry, those strains of yeast make the style, and so you as we kind of continue through the Abbey styles of Belgian beers. I think those are, you want to kind of stay in those strains. And that's, I guess, a good point too. The Abbeys that are brewing these beers typically only have one strain. They may have two strains, but they're using the same strain to ferment all of the different Abbey style beers that we're going to talk about, which is kind of cool that you can use that same yeast strain and brew wildly different strains of beer and have totally different outcomes. For example, the next one up on the Abbey styles is double, right? And that one is wildly different than the single.
Right. Yeah. So now we're moving slightly stronger and slightly darker. And, Cade, I don't think I've ever brewed a double. I've obviously drank them, but I prefer the pale Belgian styles. So I've really focused on, I haven't brewed a double or a quad because it's just, I like trying them, but I just don't need 5 gallons of it. So why don't you walk us through this one? Because I know you've had experience brewing it.
Yeah, sure. I love doubles. In fact, this was one of the earliest beer styles that I brewed. We talked earlier about like how Belgian beers got us into brewing, and this was one of the early ones that I brewed. I also annually, up until moving here to Oregon, annually brew a double with plums that are harvested from my dad's ranch in West Texas, which is a great vehicle for fruit additions. But a double, like you said, is darker than the single and more alcoholic. Now, you would think like, okay, single, double, and then we're going to get into triple and quad, and you would think we're just like multiplying the alcohol, right? Like, okay, this is double the alcohol, this is triple the alcohol, this is quadruple the alcohol of the single. But that's not really true. I mean, the alcohol is going to increase, right? And it can increase substantially. We're talking in the single at that 6% range. From a double, you might be starting in the 6% range and then go up to 8 or so on a double. The BJCP guidelines say 7.5 to 9.5. I think 8 is a really nice ABV to target for a double, but the color and the flavor of a double is nothing like a single in my mind. There's a yeast similarity, but you're using Pilsner malts, which is kind of like a single, but then you use maybe something like a Munich, you start adding some color in there, maybe you're adding some Cara for some head retention, some caramel malts for head retention, but the key difference is the use of dark candy syrup, and that is one of those ingredients that I think is amazingly useful for brewing, and when you're trying to brew these darker styles like a double or a quad, because it adds, that is a syrup that adds a lot of character and flavor to the beer. And I don't know a whole lot about the exact science of how candy syrups are made. That would be a great episode for the Brew Lab. It would be a really fun one to come back to. But what I do know is that when you add it, it adds these like dark, nutty, roasty, raisiny, prune, dried fruit notes to the beer. And it really accentuates with the right yeast. So if you're using like something like triple double, you start to get these really dark fruited notes that pair with that peppery aroma, or at least kind of pull that peppery aroma back, and you start to accentuate the fruit, right? Which is another reason, again, why I use plums, right? Dark candy syrup and plums go really well together. So I use a plum double every fall, and it is fantastic. It is really good. But these are biggish beers, right? They're 8%. These beers are meant to, for you to drink and enjoy them and taste them. Hops on this one are still continuing to be noble, and you probably will notice that we don't talk about hops very much in the Belgian styles that we're talking about today. You're just looking for bitterness to offset a little bit of the sweetness. But again, this is not a sweet style. It's highly attenuative. You're doing the same things that you're doing in those singles and strong ales and blondes, in that low, you're going to do a low temperature mash. You're going to try to increase fermentability. You're adding candy syrup, which is going to ferment mostly out. You're going to bottle condition. You're going to highly carbonate. You're going to pour it into a glass so that you get that foam. But that's, to me, what makes a really, really nice double. And I really do think here you can use things like Special B as malts if you don't want to use candy syrups, right? If you're brewing a Belgian style and you still want to comply with the Reinheitsgebot, first I would ask you why. But number two, I would say, Special B can be used as a substitute for dark candy syrups, but the dark candy syrups are really good, and there's a huge range of them, and they have different flavors, right? Don't just assume that you can change a 45 candy syrup with a 20 or with a 90, and don't assume that you can blend a 90 and a 10 to the 45 Lovabond and have the same flavor. That's just not going to work in my experience. I've used all the different candy syrups, and I love that 45 candy syrup. It's nice brown color, and it's got those wonderful raisiny, plum, fruity, dark fruit aromas that make a Belgian double. But again, the coolest thing about this style is how crisp and clean it is. It's not like a dark, thick porter or a stout or any of these English styles that might use dark beers. Because we're using a candy syrup, everything is fermenting out. It's highly alcoholic. It's highly attenuated. It's crisp. It's clean. It's refreshing. It's highly carbonated. And it's one of my favorite styles to make. And again, we're talking about intro styles. This would be a really fun one for if you're trying to get your friend interested in brewing, because there's just so much that you can do here. And it's really cool to see the beer that comes out of a double whenever you make it.
Yeah, and I think that with these, you want the phenolics and stuff to be really in balance, because with the fruity characteristics that you get from the Special B or the dark candy syrups, I think it could clash with overly phenolic expressions of yeast strains. So my recommendation for all Belgian beers that you're using these yeast, single culture yeast pitches, lambic and goose is a different conversation. I would actually recommend starting kind of cool. I think there's this rumor that's oh yeah, it's like Kvaik, you start fermenting it at 80 degrees Fahrenheit or something like that. That is really going to run the risk of throwing off a lot of stuff that could be really off-putting. And I think that clashes particularly strongly in the darker Belgian examples. So my recommendation is start at 65 degrees Fahrenheit. And with these, you have a little bit more leeway on your pitch rate. So if we're normally shooting for 0.75 for a standard strength ale pitch rate, maybe 0.5 is just fine. On the flip side, if you're using a little bit more, it's not going to cause any problems either. So I think you have a little bit of leeway in terms of the yeast amount, but I would start lower than you might think. And then you can slowly ramp up to 75 after, Kreuze and stuff has been formed over the first few days.
Totally. Driving esters is highly appropriate. So fermentation temperatures, you're going to see a wide range in Belgian yeast, and the yeast is going to perform differently at different temperatures. At least that's been my experience. When using something like triple double at the low end of the fermentation temperature curve, you're not going to get as much of the ester production. You're going to get maybe some of the more of the clove characteristics. Ramping the temperature up drives more of the esters, but then, also drives the phenolics as well too, as you're up there. But so those yeasts play at different temperatures, and you're going to have to experiment. But while we're talking about the dark beer, the double, let's go ahead and talk about the quad, because I think the quad really is just a bigger version of the double. It's just higher alcohol. Whereas in the double we're talking about 1062 to 1075 OG. For the quad we're talking about starting at 1075 and going up to 110 or 1110, 110 gravity points. And it's just a bigger beer, much bigger, 8 to 12% ABV, fuller malt body, fuller, much more depth to the beer than a double, but it's bigger. Right. And this is kind of just the difference there, right? Add more of those dark candy sugars, add a bigger malt bill, play around with things like Special B. I think Special B really shines in a quad, whereas I would play with Special B lightly in a double, because I think those dark roasted characteristics really make the quad sing. And you need something to balance that alcohol, because you don't want just a 12% alcohol burner for a quad. For me, but the classic example of a quad is that Westy 12 or the St. Bernardist Abt ABT 12. I actually don't know how to say that word, Abt 12. But those are kind of the examples of the Belgian quad. They're really high ABV. They're using Belgian candy sugars in a large portion of the recipe. Really malt forward. Hops are just there to balance bitterness. Really dry, really attenuative, and expressive Belgian yeast character.
Right, and I think that transitioning from single to triple or double to quad, both of them, you're also increasing the hop a little bit, the bitterness, just because you want, with the increased malt and ABV, you need a little bit more hops to balance that out. So from the transition up from double to quad, we're looking at maybe 5 to 10 more IBUs as you transition up. Yeah. I think talking about triple here for just a second, like the single, it's just a stronger version. We're just increasing the hops, 5 or 10 IBUs or so, and then instead of 5 to 6% or so, we're looking at more like 7.5 to 9.5%. But that's the beauty of these styles, is you could use the same yeast strain and really the same grist. It kind of makes me wonder, there might be some opportunities for party guile brewing. with these. You could make a quad and then see if you could get, with the addition of sugars especially, that you could make a double after that just using the second runnings. Ditto for a triple. So really similar styles, just how much malt, how much hops are you using, and ultimately that's what yields these different beers.
Yeah, and I think the triple though is probably not going to be dark, right? Which is interesting because you go, it's like a single to triple and then double to quad, right? Are sort of the corollaries there. So don't use dark malts in a triple. I mean, I don't know if you want to go for it, but most triples are going to be.
Well, then it's not a triple.
Yeah, it won't be a triple. It'll be a quad at that point, right? Which again, that the triple label versus quad, really the difference there, the alcohol. The alcohol of a triple is probably still going to be a little lower than a quad, but again, the key difference there is going to be those dark fruit flavors and spicy notes. So, cool. All right. Well, I think we've hit sort of the paler styles and the Abbey styles. Let's take a break, and then we're going to get into some of the stuff that makes Belgian beers a little weird, like wit beers and lambic and gooses. One of the biggest improvements to my brewing practices was the upgrade to stainless steel, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which holds 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to reduce the chances of a messy blow-off, and it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brew systems out there, and their prices are remarkably affordable. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, you've got to check out deltabrewingsystems.com. We all know that designing recipes is really fun, and doing it well is so much easier with good software. We at Brülosophy recently made the switch to Brewfather, and honestly, y'all, we could not be happier. Brewfather utilizes the latest technology to bring you the most robust cloud-based recipe design software that can be accessed anywhere, on your phone, tablet, desktop, and even offline. It also works seamlessly with numerous third-party devices to make it easier to monitor every step of your brew. I know change can be difficult, but trust me when I say you need to go to brewfather.app today to try it out for yourself. That's brewfather.app.
You may not realize it, but every minute of every day, you're enjoying your First Amendment freedoms. You can wear what you want, give out your opinion for free, even if it's unpopular. Listen to your playlist. You can put a sign out on your front lawn that says, "Vote for Bigfoot, someone you can believe in." Pray to the God of your choice, or don't. You have the right to hang with a posse that thinks like you do. Tell the government what you think about its policies. They're the freedoms that let you be you, and they're all brought to you by the First Amendment.
Moving like a river in my soul.
Learn more at freedomforum.org.
Beer trips to Belgium have inspired many brewers and even inspired one of the largest craft breweries in the United States called New Belgium. Jordan, we spent the last segment talking about Abbey styles and some of the lighter pale styles of beer as if there's a right way to brew them, right? I think we maybe gave more of our tips and tricks than said, like, here's what you absolutely have to do in order to make a good example. And I think that highlights that there's a lot of flexibility in what makes a Belgian beer. So what do you think? What makes a Belgian beer?
It's almost like more of a vibe than a prescribed set of rules, and Saison is the epitome of that.
Oh yeah.
I think that when Americans or maybe the world thinks of Saison, they think of Saison DuPont. In my opinion, that's really the archetypical example. It's such an incredible beer. But Saison, really, there are not nearly as many hard and fast rules around it. The American interpretation, we might see sour beers called Saison. We might see Brett beers, labeled as Saison. But as far as I can tell, and, I haven't had every Saison in Belgium, they're often just kind of clean, positive, highly attenuated beers that are fairly simple. I believe that Saison DuPont is, I think it's a smash beer with just Pilsner malt, a single noble hop, and maybe they have multiple yeast strains going on there. No one really knows. But at the very least, there's no Brett in that beer. And yeah, you're just trying to make a dry, light and refreshing beer with a notable, hop bitterness, but not crazy or over the top, and just really simple ingredients. You could do 100% Pilsner malt. You could do a little bit of wheat. You could do a little bit of rye. There's really no hard and fast rules. There can be some late hop character. There can be none. I think that the big thing here is yeast. You want to use a Saison yeast strain. We tend to divide those up between French and Belgian. My preference is for the Belgian, but French Saison yeast can certainly make an acceptable beer. And also, I think that blending yeast is really fun here. Blend a couple different Belgian yeast strains. Blend a French Saison strain with a Belgian Saison strain. A brewery that I shall not name, their secret to their Saison is that they're actually using a Saison strain and a Trappist strain. And so there's a lot of fun that you can have here, but I think that if you want to call this thing a Saison, you've got to use a Saison yeast strain because the type of yeast character it throws off is just fundamentally different from Abbey strains.
Yeah, totally. And this is, again, where that white pepper phenolic shines to me. I think that's a really defining characteristic of Saison yeast strains is that pepper. And to me, that's one of the things I often see Saisons with pepper added, like pink peppercorns or something added to the Saison to sort of drive that peppery characteristic up. But generally that's yeast derived. And so, yeah, I totally agree. And of course, Saison strains are the, I'm not going to say the original, but maybe they're the ones that were most well known for being diastatic, right? And so this is, again, another super highly attenuative beer. But interestingly, so like the Saison has cool history. It's sort of like the farmhouse style beer of Belgium, or really like that French speaking area of Europe, right? And so Belgium is a part of that, but also France is a part of that, and it's kind of just this French speaking area of Europe. And they made this beer that was typically lower alcohol because it was used by farmhands, right? So people that are out in the field, you can't have a bunch of drunks out, plowing fields. But you needed people to be hydrated and have sustenance and nutrients. And so this was the beer that was made for that. An upcoming episode that we've got is talking about the meaning of beer with Johnny Garrett. And this is one of those beers, one of those places where he could have focused and probably spent some time thinking about this, but could have focused on like these farmhouse and Saison style beers and how they really defined, culture and agriculture in Europe. So Saison's got a cool history to me too. If you want to nerd out with your friends, read the history of Saison DuPont and read the history of the Saison beer style. But we're talking about brewing the Saison. And so, yes, Jordan, I don't have much to add to what you said to the Saisons there. I think the yeast strain is super important. Again, it's super highly attenuative. Hops are really not present in that. I mean, it's bitter a little bit, but the hops just really play a back role to that the yeast characteristic. Now, I mentioned that the original Saisons were low ABV. I've seen high ABV Saisons too. I mean, I've seen Saisons that are 8%. I've seen Saisons that are 3%. So you've got a lot of flexibility there in terms of your range. For competition, do you think there's like an ideal strength that you would want to put in for the Saison category? And then also thinking about ABV to give you a chance to think about that. Also, what about color for Saison? Do you think like a pale or dark matters, or is there one that's better than the other for Saison?
Yeah, so when entering these into competition, you specify the strength and the color. And so I am not a big fan of dark Saisons, but you certainly can, and then there's a subcategory for them. I prefer the pale versions myself, and I also prefer the standard strength. You can go super Saison style, which is a stronger version. You can go session Saison or table beer. I just like the straight in the middle one. So I recently published an experiment testing the effect of yeast nutrient on a Saison, and it was not significant, and I had some bottles left over. These bottles store really well. I've heard brewers say that they think the Saison tastes really great after like 6 months of bottle conditioning. So they have a really long shelf life on them, which I love. And then you can have, be blasting through your kegs of IPA and lager and stuff and just have these that you slowly pick away at over the course of a year or so. So I just entered them into a competition and got a bronze in a pretty big category. So My problem on those is I over-carbonated them, and it was kicking up yeast in suspension when pouring and gushing. So you want a really high carb, 3.2, 3.5, but the problem is if you're shooting that high and then you get some additional slow attenuation in the bottle, it could be even more carbed. They say that it's like it takes 1 week to get 90% of the attenuation on these beers and then like 2 or 3 more weeks for the final 10%. The tail on these Saison attenuations is really slow. So just be prepared that they're not going to blast through the wort like a Kvik strain. So you can go to the website to see that recipe, but it's just mostly Pilsner malt, 9% wheat, 4.5% dextrose. We're using Warrior for 15 IBUs at the 60-minute edition, a couple ounces of Tettning in a 5-gallon batch at 30 minutes, and then a couple more ounces of German Tettning at 5 minutes. 1050 OG, 1005 FG, that's 5.9% ABV with 29 IBUs. And then on the water profile, we're looking at a higher sulfate to chloride ratio. I'm doing a 2-to-1, so 100 sulfate to 50 chloride. So nothing crazy. These beers are simple, but they can be really good. Don't overthink it.
Yeah, that's totally right. And speaking of hardware, I can't believe we forgot to mention your gold medal NHC for your Belgian single when we were talking about singles earlier. I can't believe we forgot to mention that. That's cool. So that recipe's also out there too, right? All the gold medal recipes get published, I believe, right?
Well, they say brewers make wort, yeast makes beer. And with Belgian beers, that is really true. So I was the steward for that beer, but I got to give a lot of credit to the yeast that I used.
Yeah, fair enough. We should have mentioned to spend a little bit more time talking about that when we were talking about singles, but I would be remiss not to mention that. So Jordan has, dedicated. I also have medals for my double. I won a silver in the Dallas homebrew competition with my double. So yeah, we've got some hardware on the wall for these. Now, I want to briefly hit wit beers, but I want to spend the last bit of the show talking about lambics and gooses because I think that's something that you and I both love. It's a style that we really enjoy. And one style that I also brewed a lot is wit beer. And actually, interestingly, this was one of the questions on my Cicerone exam. Was essentially one of the written exam questions is profile a beer style. Write about its history. Write about commercial examples. What makes a good style. What it should be served with food. All this kind of stuff. And wit beer was the one. This is hilarious. It asks you have to provide a commercial example, and guess what commercial example I did not provide, Jordan, because I couldn't remember it.
Hoegaarden.
Yeah, right. And Hoegaarden, of course, is that typical commercial example. If you were living in Austin at the time, back a few years ago, you were able to get Celis White. I don't think that's being brewed anymore. Blanche de Brussels is also a famous wit beer. But the key thing about wit beer is the use of spices. So it's and white beer, wheat, this can be as like 50% wheat, 50% malted barley. You can play with the percentages. You can go 60% malted barley, 40% wheat, whatever. But it's a wheat beer. But there's spices that are added to it, which again is just another example of Belgians being like, screw you, Germans. We're not just gonna limit ourselves to these 4 ingredients. We're gonna put orange peel and coriander in our beer. Those are key characteristics, and they play so well with those fruity characters of the yeast. Now, again, use a wit beer type yeast because it's going to kick off the right phenolics in that sort of coriander spicy range, and it's going to kick off the right fruity esters that are going to play well with the bitter orange peel. And I do think you have to use bitter orange peel and coriander when you make a wit beer. There are examples out there, commercial examples, that don't use those spices, and people will fight about this. But to me, that's what makes a good wit beer, is having those spices. How do you add those spices? Well, you can put them in a hop sock and add them directly to the fermenter. You can make a tincture, which I've done before. I actually much prefer the tincture, so using something like a high ethanol spirit like Everclear or something like that, and soaking the coriander and bitter orange peel and then pouring in that liquid into the fermenter. You can add them directly into the fermenter. The reason I don't add directly into the fermenter is if you do too much, you've ruined the beer. You put too much coriander in there, and that beer is going to start to taste like soap. And so the addition of these spices, use a light hand at first, play around with tinctures, and then once you kind of figure out where you like to be, then you can go with using those spices and styles. But I don't know, anything else you want to add about wit beers, Jordan?
I think that also some people are adding those ingredients at the end of the boil. And you mentioned bitter orange peel. We've probably tested that, but that's, the traditional one is this dried bitter orange peel. But you can, just hand peel some peel from a navel orange or something from the grocery store. That works too. So, feel free to experiment with different, orange ingredients. Your mileage may vary.
Yeah, exactly. All right, now I don't want to just minimize that style, but lambic and gouzes I feel like are the other like sexy beer style of Belgium, right? And we've talked about it a bunch on the show, Jordan. You have a lot of experience brewing lambics and gouzes.
Right. So now we're getting into the spontaneous fermentation beers. So historically, these beers, the big difference is that they're not pitched with a yeast strain by hand. We let the night air inoculate them. Famously made around Brussels, Belgium area, and they're fairly simple beers in terms of the recipe design. We're looking at something like 60% Pilsner malt, 40% raw wheat. But then after that is when things start to get weird. So we're doing a turbid mash on these. So it's like kind of like a modified decoction of sorts. Mad Fermentationist has a great write-up on them. And also I keep an eye out in the coming year. I hope to produce an article for the website on those. But it's a long time to get all the photos together, as you'll discover in this next few minutes talking about this. So we do a decoction mash, which is going to generate a really complex starch profile for that beer. And then we're going to boil the heck out of it. So lambic brewers are brewing for maybe boiling for like 4 hours, perhaps. I think at the homebrew level, you can get a really good concentration fairly quickly. So I haven't really needed to boil too much longer than 2 hours, but we're starting with really low wort, like really low OG, something like 1030 or 1025, and you want to concentrate that down to like 1045. And along the way, we're going to be boiling aged hops. So how I have a stash of aged hops that I've been digging into for years. Some of them I got from friends, but when I used to grow my own hops, the hops that didn't make it into the fresh hop brew day, I would just store those in a paper bag, and then I would just have this kind of like constant like churning supply of aged hops to access. I don't grow hops anymore after moving to my new home, so I'm getting a little worried that someday I'm going to actually run out of these things because they're not as easy to acquire. And I would really recommend using whole cone as opposed to pellets because their ability to age and degrade the alpha acids is much greater. So you're looking for like a 5-gallon boil, which would go down to maybe 3 gallons or so, about 2.5 ounces of aged hops per 5-gallon boil. So if you're going to do like a 10-gallon set up to concentrate down to 5 gallons of fermented lambic beer, you're looking at about 5 ounces in that scenario. And you're just going to add those at the beginning and boil them the whole 2-3 hours or whatever. You can adjust your water chemistry. You cannot, depending on where you live. But this is a beer that you don't have to think the water profile too hard. And then, traditionally, you would do a cool ship. So you're going to, after the boil, you're going to transfer to another vessel called a cool ship, and you're going to let that sit overnight with like the windows open in the winter because the microbes that are happening in the winter are ideal. You don't want to do this in the summer. And I don't know that you want to do this in Mexico. So you want to be more likely to do this in northern states, but I know that there are people making spontaneous beers in New Mexico, et cetera. So it can be done in warmer climates, but it tends to be more aligned with the European kind of latitude there. And you're letting it sit overnight, and then you're transferring to barrels the next day, and then you have a really long and slow fermentation. So I have done some true spontaneous beers like that before, and they never worked out well. So my trick is I do everything I just described. I do the cool ship. I let it sit overnight. What I do, I don't have a cool ship. I just transfer off of the kettle tube into another kettle that I just put in my basement next to an open window overnight. And then what I do the next day is when I transfer to my carboy for fermentation, I pitch a built-up culture that I got from reliable lambic sources. So my culture was based on some bottles of Cantillon and Drie-Fonteinen. Cantillon, of course, is not as readily accessible in the U.S. That was from Bottle Share Night, and we saved the dregs from those. But you can totally... Drie-Fonteinen is way easier to find in the U.S., so get some bottles of those. They don't use a killer wine strain for their bottle conditioning. They're using like fresh lambic. And then you can access the pure mixed culture from Brussels area. Do not use a American sour beer or some other sour beer because it's not the same strain and you will not get that authentic lambic flavor. So you can skip the cool ship step at home if you're going to use this culture. Or you could, roll the dice and hopefully capture sufficient microbes in the air without adding any additional bottle-derived cultures. But it's really helpful insurance, and you've tasted it. I'm making fantastic lambic using this method. And then you want to just put it in a carboy, let it go for like a year. Make sure that you're not, don't take samples, do not expose to oxygen, keep the airlock filled up. And then you can bottle that straight. Definitely would recommend bottle conditioning these in thick brown bottles. They might take 6 months to really start to taste good. They can have this kind of weird bottle conditioning phase where it tastes off, like even burnt rubber, but it will change and evolve in the bottle and get better. So give it time, and store those, of course, at cellar temp. Cantillon, they store theirs stacked horizontally. You could do that. You can also just leave them in the box. And then if you want to add fruit, age it on a ton of fruit, and then similar bottle conditioning process. And what my recommendation would be is make this an annual project and save a little bit each year in a vessel that's not, exposed to a ton of oxygen, low headspace or, purge kegs. So you can finally do that goose blend, which is approximately 60% 1 year aged, 30% 2 year, and 10% 3 year, and then you can blend that and have a straight goose blend in your bottle.
Yeah, that's a fantastic rundown on lambic and goose. And you hit all the things there. There were a couple of things I just wanted to highlight, and part of this is part of that discussion that I had with the guys at Lambic Fabrique, which is just outside of Brussels, and a fantastic goosery blendery.
I got to try one recently.
Did you really?
Yeah, there's this really great beer bar in Las Vegas. What's it called? It's killing me. I can't remember the name of it. But it's like the best craft beer bar in Vegas. It's off strip, and they had it on draft.
Yeah, oh, really? Wow, that's amazing. Yeah, it's a really, really cool place, and it's kind of fun because they are one of the few blenderies, right? Goose makeries, I guess, gooseries. There you go. That actually make the wort like you were talking about, and a large number of gooseries or blenderies don't make their own wort. They get it from other places, and in fact, Lambic Fabrique makes wort that they ship off to other places. It's kind of cool, because there's kind of like two parts of lambic and goose making. It's the wort production, which they kind of it depends. It's important, right? And the guys at Lambic Fabrique don't minimize it. They make their wort, but most gooseries and goose makers would say, yeah, whatever. It just whatever. It's going to do its thing and just put it in a barrel and we'll deal with it in a year or 2 or 3 years. That's the real key, is like the barrels and the blending and making things, putting this barrel with that barrel and stuff. And that's where they really find their love of goose and of lambic. And so the difference between lambic and goose is lambic is just is either not barrel aged or it's single.
They're all barrel aged. It's that lambic is not blended of multiple years.
Okay, yeah, it's not blended multiple years. It's just 1 year, right? That it's done. Thank you for that. Goose is blended across multiple different years, and like Jordan said, there are restrictions on what can be blended together for gooses. But the wort production, you mentioned that turbid mash, and that is super important. And the guys at Lambic Fabrique called it food for that's why they do it. They're making food for the microorganisms, and this is super important, right? We think as brewers that yeast is the only microorganism, and so we just try to make starch and convert it into fermentable sugars that yeast can consume. And in the other examples of Belgian beer, we were doing a low temperature and we were trying to drive attenuation and all that stuff. But that's actually bad for alembic. We need food for those other bugs. We need it for the lactic acid and for the Brettanomyces and the Pediococcus and these other things that are going to get inoculated in the spontaneous fermentation. They can consume the dextrins that yeast can't. So it's still going to dry out. It's still going to dry out all the way down to those same attenuation levels that, say, a triple or a saison would, but it's going to do it through a different microorganism. And that's really the key here. And again, so that's why it's important. That turbid mash is food for the bugs. So you're creating a whole bunch of unfermentables, not fermentable by yeast, right? And leaving food for the bugs to eat. But you mentioned the timing too. So they only make, the guys at Lambic Fabrique only brew wort from October 15th to May 15th. And that's it. And the example they gave is like, yeah, okay, if you leave an apple out on the table in October, how does that look versus if you leave an apple out on the table in July? Right. One of them goes bad really quickly. The cool ship is sitting out overnight. I mean, it's beer and it's sitting out overnight and it can spoil if you don't treat it appropriately. So having that cool window, the wood, the draft, I mean, going into Cantillon, there's mold everywhere. It's the most disgusting brewery I've ever been in my life. And it's making some of the most world-class beers I've ever tasted. Right. But it's so disgusting and they want all that mold and they want all that characteristic, but they don't want it to turn bad, right? So Cantillon, when we were there in May, was not brewing because they had already closed down for the season, and so they don't brew in the summer because they don't want to have those bugs or have the wort spoil. And then you said two other things which the Lambic Fabrique guys drove home to me. Oxygen. Oxygen is horrible for lambics because it usually it comes with acetic acid bacteria, and we're not making vinegar here. A little bit of acetic acid, okay, fine, no big deal. But the Lambic Fabrique guys said once you've got acetic acid in your barrel's done. It's cooked. You're not going to be able to make good lambic or gose. You're going to make great vinegar with it, but you're not going to make good lambic or gose. So, and oxygen are the two oxygen and alcohol are the two things that acetic acid bacteria need to survive. Barrels are porous, so oxygen makes ingress, and of course, you've got alcohol from the yeast in the fermentation. So they have all the food that they want. They'll make a great vinegar, but not a good lambic. So oxygen is horrible for lambics and gose. We're not talking about just like slightly reduced esters or fruity characteristics. We're talking about like making vinegar at this point. Can really drive things out of proportion. You can still save it by blending it potentially, depending on what you can blend with it. But hey, if you make vinegar out of it, fantastic. You have basically a lifetime supply of vinegar that you can use for cooking. And it probably is going to taste just fine.
And so I think at the homebrew level, there's really no need to use a barrel. I agree. That's more of a professional production level thing. And then also you do not need to add wood chips to these beers. These are not wood focused beers. The barrels are neutral. They're simply a vessel. So I would not be too worried about the wood aspect at the homebrew level. Just use a carboy and keep that airlock filled up. Don't take samples, or use a keg, and you can really minimize oxygen ingress there. In my opinion, overly acetic lambics are awful. And that is not the last thing you want in here. So keep oxygen out. Don't worry about barrels at the homebrew level unless you're, one of these barrel bros. And then obviously that's really cool, but that's a pretty advanced thing that I don't think is necessary to make great lambic and goose at home.
I totally agree. I think you can make it great in stainless steel tanks. And in fact, there's a lot of lambic production that isn't in wood barrels in Belgium, right? And so that's totally okay. The other thing...
Who's that?
What's that?
Who's doing it in stainless?
A lot of the primary fermentations are take place in stainless and then get transferred into a fewter or into a barrel or something after they're done with the initial, let's call it initial souring, right?
Or initial ethanol production.
Ethanol production, yeah, they might even be inoculating in stainless. I mean, it's kind of like the underbelly. It wouldn't be traditional goose, right? It would not qualify as traditional goose under those conditions, or even really traditional lambic. It would just be a more commercial way to produce large volumes of lambic. And so there were some stories of those brewers out there that are doing that.
And I guess that's a good closing point here, is that they are very protective of these appellation terms, lambic and goose. And so if you're not brewing in that region of Belgium around Brussels, then it's not technically lambic or goose. It's a spontaneous lambic goose inspired style. And so as we brew them at home here in the States, we can call them whatever we want, but they don't want us to. So acknowledge the giant's shoulders that we're standing on here.
Yeah, totally. And same thing for Abbey, right? If you can't make a Trappist beer unless you are a Trappist monk, right, or working in a Trappist monastery. Those are protected appellations. And so we're homebrewers though, and so that for us gives us the ability to still make these styles and imitate them, right, and say Belgian style or lambic style or goose style, but the awe, and this is a good closing point too, right? The shoulders of giants here. These are all giants. Every beer style that we talked about today we're talking about Duvel. That's Duvel Mortgat. That's one of the largest breweries in the world, right? That's a Belgian style beer. We're talking about the Trappist. We're talking about lambics. We're talking about all of these different beer styles that are the shoulders of giants from this little tiny country, right? That's like right in the middle of Europe. It's this little tiny place, but it's had just an epic impact on the world brewing. And the goose, and I'm glad we finished with the goose and the lambic, because sitting there with Lambic Fabrique, it's a totally different brewing ethos when you're talking about lambic and goose. You are not trying to rip the beer out in 7 days, right? And they were saying like time is your friend. If that beer is it ages in a barrel for 8 years or 15 years, great, fantastic. If it tastes shitty after 3 years, they're not going to blend it just because, okay, it's been 3 years, I can now put this into a blend. They don't care. They're going to let those barrels sit as long as they have to make the best beer. And I think that's just a really cool way to think about that.
I think that's a really good closing statement. Brewing Belgian beer isn't that hard, but it can take a lifetime to master and requires a lot of patience.
Yeah, I love it. I think that's a fantastic closing argument. I'm going to leave it right there. All right, Jordan. Well, thanks. This was fun talking about Belgian styles. And of course, we'll be back in 2 weeks with our next Applying the Science episode. See y'all then. The Brew Lab is a production of Brülosophy, where they who drink beer think beer. Don't forget to visit Brülosophy.com to read about our weekly experiments and other brewing adventures, and listen to us talk about it on our other show, the Brülosophy Podcast. Thanks to all of our sponsors and patrons that help make this show possible. If you'd like to receive a reward for helping us do what we do, visit patreon.com/Brülosophy to see how you can do just that. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back in the Brew Lab with another guest next week. Until then, think beer.
Imagine relying on a dozen different software programs to run your business, none of which are connected, and each one more expensive and more complicated than the last. It can be pretty stressful. Now, imagine Odoo. Odoo has all the programs you'll ever need, and they're all connected on one platform. Doesn't Odoo sound amazing? Let Odoo harmonize your business with simple, efficient software that can handle everything for a fraction of the price. Sign up today at odoo.com. That's ODOO.com.